April 5th, 1909. The Arizona Gazette, a legitimate regional newspaper, not a tabloid, ran a front-page story claiming that a Smithsonian-backed expedition had discovered a massive cave system carved into the walls of the Grand Canyon. Not a small cave. A network of passages containing mummies, copper weapons, hieroglyphic tablets, and a central idol described as resembling the Buddha. The explorer who found it, a man named G.E. Kinkaid, said the entrance was 1,486 feet down a sheer canyon wall on government land. He said visitors would be turned away under penalty of trespass. He said the Smithsonian had already assembled a team of 30 to 40 scientists. The Smithsonian has been asked about this story for over 100 years. Their answer has never changed. No record of G.E. Kinkaid, no record of Professor S.A. Jordan, no knowledge of any such expedition, no artifacts in their collection from any Grand Canyon cave. The article was never retracted. What followed was one of the most durable hoaxes in American history, a story that has been debunked repeatedly, in detail, by journalists, librarians, park historians, and the Smithsonian itself, and that nonetheless circulates today as evidence of suppressed archaeology, hidden civilizations, and government cover-ups reaching back to the dawn of American history. I came to this through a different door than most people who write about it. I wasn't looking for the cave. I was trying to understand why a story this thoroughly debunked keeps coming back, and what it keeps displacing. Because every time someone makes a video about the iron door, and the sealed tunnels, and the things nobody wants you to know, there is a real story about this exact stretch of canyon that doesn't get told. A story with real names, real sites, real suppression, and real people who were denied access to their own most sacred ground for decades. The word the Hopi use for that site is Sipapuni. It is the place where, in Hopi cosmology, their ancestors emerged from the underworld into this world. It is a physical location, a travertine dome and spring near the confluence of the Little Colorado and Colorado rivers, not a metaphor, as Lyle Balancourt, a Hopi archaeologist and Grand Canyon river guide, has said. Down in the confluence area, there is also the Sipapuni, which is the cultural origin point for Hopi ancestors. That emergence point symbolizes our coming from a previous world into this world, seeking a new way of life. The official history tells us the 1909 Gazette story was a slow news day fabrication, probably the work of a reporter who had heard of Joseph Mulhattan, a notorious hoaxer of the era. And it almost certainly was. But it was also something else. A story placed precisely in the one stretch of canyon already known, by anyone paying attention, to be the most sacred ground in the Southwest. Not by coincidence, by design. Here is the detail about this stretch of canyon that every video about the 1909 hoax mentions briefly and then moves past, because if you actually stop and look at it, it becomes more interesting than the hoax itself. On official United States government maps, the formations in the same stretch of canyon as the supposed Kinkaid location have been named after Egyptian deities since the 1880s. Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, Horus Temple, the Tower of Set, the Tower of Ra. In the same area, geologist Clarence Dutton placed Hindu deity names: Shiva Temple, Brahma Temple, Vishnu Temple. These names were officially adopted by the US Board on Geographic Names as early as 1906, 3 years before the Kinkaid article appeared. The standard explanation is that Dutton simply had a habit of giving exotic, mythological names to geological formations, that he felt the canyon scale deserved names drawn from the world's great traditions. That is technically true. It explains nothing about why this specific section of an Arizona canyon received the Egyptian pantheon. No other section of the Grand Canyon, or any other American canyon, received this treatment. The Egyptian-named formations are not scattered, they are clustered together, in the same general area as the Kinkaid location. The names predate the 1909 article by 30 years. This is the thread that the conspiracy version of this story pulls on, and pulls on hard, to argue that someone knew something, that the names weren't decorative but descriptive. that Egyptian artifacts really were found here, and the naming was either a coded acknowledgement or a deliberate breadcrumb left by men who couldn't say openly what they'd discovered. That reading requires you to believe that Dutton was in on something, that the Gazette article was real despite the Smithsonian's categorical denials, and that an expedition involving dozens of scientists somehow left zero independent trace in the documentary record of 1909. What it doesn't require you to believe, what it actively distracts you from, is the far simpler question of what was actually in this stretch of canyon before Dutton named anything, before the Gazette printed anything, and before any explorer with a wooden boat floated past and claimed to see stains on a cliff wall. The Hopi village of Oraibi, just to the northeast of this canyon, is considered the oldest continuously inhabited community in the United States, with documented evidence of occupation dating to AD 1150. And the Hopi and their Puebloan ancestors spent significant time in the Grand Canyon itself. Their handprints, clan symbols, and astronomical observatories are distributed across this landscape. When Dutton stood on the rim in the 1880s and looked out at formations he decided to name after Isis and Osiris and Shiva, he was standing on ground the Hopi had been reading, precisely, ceremonially, over generations for centuries before he arrived. He named it after the gods of civilizations an ocean away, the civilization whose sacred geography he was actually standing inside didn't make it onto his maps at all. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how 19th century American cartography worked. And it is, quietly, more revealing than anything in the 1909 newspaper. Here is where the history becomes genuinely uncomfortable, and it has nothing to do with the 1909 newspaper. The same year, the Arizona Gazette ran its front-page cave story. The federal boarding school system that had been operating since 1879 was at its peak. Its founding philosophy, stated openly by the man who built it, Army General Richard Henry Pratt, was to kill the Indian and save the man. Over its nearly 30 years in operation, more than 12,000 Native American children attended the Carlisle Indian Industrial School alone. Children were removed from families, forbidden from speaking their languages, forced to cut their hair, stripped of their names, and placed in an Anglo-American cultural environment designed to make them unrecognizable to their own communities when they returned. The Hopi resisted this more visibly than almost any other nation. In November 1894, soldiers were dispatched to the Hopi village of Oraibi and arrested 18 men who had refused to send their children to boarding school. In 1894, 19 Hopi men were taken to Alcatraz Island, about 1,000 miles from their families, and imprisoned for a year for the same refusal. This was happening at the exact same moment that Clarence Dutton's Egyptian-named formations were going onto official government maps. At the exact same moment that a generation of Hopi children were being removed from the communities that carried the ceremonial knowledge of the Sipapuni. At the exact same moment that the transmission of that knowledge, where the site was, how to approach it, what spiritual preparation was required, was being deliberately interrupted. Hopi scholars themselves have acknowledged this. The transmission of ceremonial knowledge was interrupted during the period of forced assimilation. Some elders have noted that the precise site location may have drifted in the oral record during that gap. What is visited now may or may not be the exact original site. That is not a footnote. That is the real suppression story in this stretch of canyon. Not the Smithsonian hiding Egyptian mummies. A living people denied access to what they consider their most sacred ground for multiple generations by a combination of federal policy, NPS access restrictions, and the deliberate dismantling of the ceremonial lineages that held the knowledge of how to get there. The restrictions fall on everyone equally. Curious independent researchers and the Hopi people trying to reach their own sacred site are both told no. That parallel is the sharpest thing about this story. The 1909 hoax, with its iron doors and its mummies and its sealed government secrets, has generated a century of YouTube videos, podcasts, and conspiracy threads. The boarding school system, which actually sealed off Hopi ceremonial knowledge in a way no iron door ever could, gets a paragraph in a Wikipedia article most people never click on. Not gradually, not through neglect. Through the Civilization Fund Act of 1819, the Indian Appropriations Act, the off-reservation boarding school system, formally launched in 1879, and a sustained federal policy that ran for the better part of a century. A specific sequence of legal and institutional acts aimed at a specific people in the same generation that a newspaper reporter in Phoenix invented an explorer and placed him in the most sacred canyon on the continent. I want to be careful about what I'm actually claiming here. I'm not arguing that the 1909 Arizona Gazette story was real. It almost certainly wasn't. A contemporary Arizona paper called it a Mulhutton story within days of publication, a reference to a known hoaxer of the era, and the Smithsonian's denial has been consistent and categorical for over a century. There are no Egyptian mummies in the Grand Canyon. There was no Professor Jordan. G.E. Kinkaid almost certainly never existed. The iron door in the cliff is a newspaper invention, and the hairy ones referenced in online retellings don't appear in the original 1909 article at all. They're later editions, layered onto the hoax by people who needed it to be stranger than it already was. What I am arguing is this: the hoax worked, and keeps working, because it was placed in the right canyon, a stretch of river that already had Egyptian god names on the official maps, that already sat adjacent to the most sacred site in Hopi cosmology, that was already, in 1909, the center of a real suppression story that nobody was writing front-page articles about. As Lai Kwamwisima, former director of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, has said, "The Grand Canyon is very special to us. It's our genesis, and it's also our final spiritual home." He said that the Hopi were told to migrate and put their footprints as far as they could across the land, and that eventually, when a spirit leaves this world, it travels back to the Grand Canyon. This is not ancient history to the Hopi. It is active, living cosmology, maintained through ceremonial practice that was nearly broken by a generation of federal policy, and is still being repaired. Picture that stretch of canyon now. The red wall limestone walls rise 1,000 feet above the Colorado. Hundreds of known cave openings in those walls, most unmapped, most inaccessible. This is not ancient history to the Hopi. It is active, living cosmology, maintained through ceremonial practice that was nearly broken by a generation of federal policy, and is still being repaired. Picture that stretch of canyon now. The red wall limestone walls rise 1,000 feet above the Colorado. Hundreds of known cave openings in those walls, most unmapped, most inaccessible. The turquoise water of the Little Colorado coming in from the east, and a few miles upstream, the Sipapuni, a travertine dome and spring that the Hopi have identified as the precise physical location where their ancestors emerged into this world. You cannot reach it without a multi-year permit wait list or a government-to-government negotiation. The same federal land management system that prevented independent explorers from verifying the 1909 hoax also prevented Hopi ceremonial practitioners from completing pilgrimages their tradition had been making for centuries. We have lost the ability to tell this canyon's history as one continuous story, not because the records don't exist, because for a century, the story that got the attention, the iron doors, the mummies, the sealed Smithsonian secrets, was so much more entertaining than the one that actually happened. The one with real names, real dates, real children taken 1,000 miles from home, and a real sacred site that living people were denied access to across multiple generations. Lyle Balancourt, Hopi archaeologist and river guide, has said that even he, working the canyon regularly, has never been to the physical location of the Sipapuni, because of the cultural requirements and spiritual preparation it demands. He said he wants visitors to understand that the canyon is not just a beautiful place to photograph, that it still has continued cultural significance for modern living indigenous people. That's the part that gets quiet when you stand at the rim, not the mystery of what might be sealed behind an iron door somewhere in the rock. The weight of what was deliberately unsealed, what was pulled out of people and discarded, in the same decades that a newspaper reporter in Phoenix was busy inventing explorers. So why do we describe what happened in this canyon as a mystery waiting to be uncovered, rather than as a history that has already been partially told and deliberately ignored, because invented iron doors are more comfortable than the ones that were actually used.